Sayego, I'm John Kane, and this is Resistance Radio. I want to thank you for joining me. As always, it is a great pleasure and honor to be on the airwaves in New York City on WBAI and in Washington, D.C. on WPFW. I urge you, as listeners of these stations, or however you're listening to the program, that you support these stations for allowing me to have this block of time on their radio stations. And of course, with that block of time, I don't just fill the airwaves in those two stations. I take the video and I put it up, or I record video and I put it up on YouTube and on Facebook, and I put the audio up as a podcast. So you've got a number of ways you can listen. Of course, you can always go to the archives of those stations and check out the show as well. But there's any number of ways to catch much of what I'm doing here. So I thank you for joining me. I encourage you to support the radio stations that carry this program. Look, I do want to acknowledge, although I don't know specifically, I know that there are Pacifica affiliates that also run the show, and so my shout out to any of those guys who are, whether they do it each week or whether they just do it from time to time, even if I'm just a little bit of filler sometimes. I appreciate you guys, giving me some space to allow my conversations to reach other people. And that's really what this is about. And I look, I get it. We're in a spot now where we get a lot of information from a lot of different places. We used to just watch television, right, or catch news on the radio, and now with podcasts and with social media and frankly, even television resembles more social media than it does anything resembling news from when I grew up and that kind of stuff. So, part of the whole thing is there's access to a lot of information, but there's also a lot of misinformation. Now, there's a lot of good information available if you know how to look for it, and you know how to again do real research. But for the most part, we're being inundated all the time with a bunch of narratives. So I want to address two specific narratives. One is this notion that the U.S. Constitution was based almost entirely, by some making the claim, on the way that the Haudenosaunee govern themselves, our Guyana Goa, our great law, and I want to debunk that. So I want to set that. I want to acknowledge why some people do this, and people that I respect have done this, but I want to set the record straight. The other one is, while I appreciate those who will address this notion that many non-native people have, that native people were simply conquered by the United States, and so to refute this notion of conquest, I think is important. But I also have to address the issue about our identity, because if we identify ourselves as Americans, as U.S. citizens, I think it's a harder. I think it's a harder argument to make that we haven't been conquered. So I want to address some of that. So I'm going to address those two things. But first, let me remind people that not only are we on these two radio stations, WPFW in Washington D.C. and on WBAI in New York City, I I appreciate those two markets because of the significance that both New York City plays in New York State politics, and of course, the significance that Washington D.C. plays in national politics. Neither of which are mine, but they impact us. So I appreciate that. Um, but in an effort to tell a bigger story, many of you know that I was involved in producing a film last year, and that film is called The Long Hope. And we are taking it on the road. I've got a couple of events. In fact, I got an event coming up on the 21st of February at the University at Buffalo. We are going to do a screening and a panel discussion. I've got another event planned at the Mashantucket Pequot Museum in the following month, and then I have another scheduled date for a screening and conversation at Mount Holyoke College in Massachusetts. So, I mean, we're getting it out there, and those are just three dates, over 3 months. We're still filling in dates in between there. We're doing some other more local screenings. I encourage people to reach out to me if you're interested in either in collaborating or hosting a screening. Even some of what I'm going to talk about today is covered in the film. So I think it's important that people uh, get an opportunity to see the film. and understand, at least the perspective that myself and my co-producers put out in this film, which I think is quite factual. I don't think the movie is not based. The film is not based on us just expressing opinions. Now, you can debate whether some of what I have to say today is more of an opinion than facts, but I think I'm going to maintain a pretty factual basis for it. The other thing I want to mention is I didn't mention last week that we are in Black History Month. For those of you who listen to the program, I'm not a big fan of this notion of designating a day or a month or a holiday or whatever else towards you know, towards an oppression that continues. And so it's hard for me to get too excited about Native American Heritage Month or Black History Month or any Pride Month, any month that is supposed to be um, some sort of bone thrown to those of us who have been oppressed. I won't say that I don't use the opportunities when they do present themselves. My hope always is that because they make these designations and these proclamations and these resolutions, that maybe the phone will ring. Maybe somebody will say, "Hey, we got to talk to this guy." Not so much. Not so much. I mean, Native people are still predominantly left out of most conversations. Even on Native issues, we're left out of most conversations. So, um, but I do want to acknowledge that the shortest month of the year has been designated to, I guess, honor or at least draw some attention to Black history. And so all I'll say is good luck. I hope the non-Black community affords you the opportunity and the access to media and to everything else that you perhaps don't have normally. I hope they do that at least on this month. So it's too bad you got to share it with President's Days. I think today is considered Abraham Lincoln's birthday, and as many of you know, I'm not a big fan. I'm not a big fan. He signed the execution order for the largest mass execution in the history of the United States when he signed the execution order for the 38 Dakota to be hung by the neck in Mankato, Minnesota, a week before his Emancipation Proclamation. I'll just mention that as a side. All right, let me get to what I wanted to talk about. Look, there are many podcasts out there. There are many video podcasts out there. There are many people who are putting information out there, and I'm glad that they're doing it. Let me just say that right from the start. I'm glad there are people doing some of this work. But I think some of the conversations that are had need to be more fully vetted. And while I don't mind somebody suggesting that the United States had was significantly influenced by Native people in how they were going to form their governing systems and that kind of stuff, I think there's a huge inaccuracy when I hear some people say that our great law, our Guyana de Goa, was used as the framework or the basis for the U.S. Constitution. There was even a number of years ago, I don't know, some of you may have seen this. There was actually a poster that was done, and I don't know if it was done by the Smithsonian or by some Native organization. I don't know, NCAI, I don't know. And it had a picture of the Hayawenta Belt, which is the belt that we use. Actually, we've turned it into a flag. It's considered the Confederacy flag, but the Hayawenta Belt is a wampum belt that essentially represents the time when our five nations, because Tuscarora wasn't with us at least not in this instance, five nations reunified under the Guyana de Goa. So that's what the Hayawenta Belt essentially symbolizes. And I saw this poster with an image of that, of course, with other native images and that kind of stuff in the background. And it said, "This what you're looking at is the first draft of the U.S. Constitution." And I know a lot of Native people love that poster and they love the idea of it, and and it's in a way it seems uplifting to suggest that this great country of the United States really got its identity from us. Well, I want to talk about that. I'm going to talk a little bit about Guyana de Goa. I talked about Turo Wampum last week, and there are many people who think that played a huge influence on the formation of the Constitution. And I don't think that was the case either. But let me talk about the Guyana de Goa. And and every step along the way here, I'm going to talk about the distinction from what exists in the United States versus what our system was. First and foremost, our what people know as the Great Law or the Guyana de Goa, the one thing that was the most pronounced and underlying um, feature of it of our systems was the absence of hierarchy. Now, now of course, that's not the case with the U.S. Constitution. The U.S. Constitution is rife with hierarchy, even where it's not written. The hierarchy is clear. I mean, it was written for white rich men. That's what the Constitution was written for. I mean, they were the ones, because if you were just a white guy, because they weren't even really making that much distinction between white and black and that kind of stuff. I mean, there was just the aristocracy, who were pretty much the Brits, and everybody else who worked for them. And when the colonists decided they were going to revolt against the United Kingdom, they were about protecting themselves and their wealth, their personal wealth. And I'm going to talk about some of the details in the U.S. Constitution, some written and some not written, but that are clearly there, to prove that, first off, the U.S. Constitution is not a democracy. The founding fathers of the U.S. Of the United States abhorred. They rejected this notion of democracy and majority rule. They didn't want that. They knew that the base population of these colonies were not adequately informed to make intelligent decisions about governance, and so they rejected it. In fact, they simplified it to the point where some would suggest that if the majority had power, that they would just loot the treasury. They would destroy everything. So there was an absolute avoidance and rejection of democracy by the founding fathers in both framing the Constitution and how they governed. So I want to make that perfectly clear. On the other hand, the Haudenosaunee, or Haudenosaunee, what we had was something that was based not on just majority rule, but on utilizing the voices of the people, bringing our people together to reach consensus. Not just consensus based on majority rule. I mean, more of a consensus that we ultimately come to an agreement. Now, granted, it's not a fast process, and you could argue it's not an efficient process. But the basic way that both our longhouses within our community, within our nations, and within our overall confederacy, the way they operated was based on deliberation through the three sides of the longhouse, somewhat figuratively and metaphorically, but that's what we talked about. We talked about deliberation that went back and forth between two sides of the longhouse, with the third side not weighing in until the two sides have either stalled in their deliberation or until they come to an agreement. And that's when the third side, and we can debate because different nations do things different ways. I know when we come to Grand Council, what we have the younger brothers, the Oneidas and the Cayugas and the Tuscaroras on one side, and we have the Senecas and Mohawks on the other, and the Onondaga is on the third side, because Onondaga is considered the central fire. Not that they have more authority, but they are seated in a different place than the other two sides. So that's basically how things work in the Grand Council. And again, deliberation goes between the younger brothers and the older brothers, and if they agree, then the third side does have an opportunity to voice what they've gotten from their people on a given subject, and to either leave the decision to have more deliberation back in the communities, or to essentially concede and agree and reach consensus with the other two sides. And if the deadlock is such on the two sides of the longhouse, then the third side, the Onondaga side in this case, would break the tie, and the odd side out would essentially concede and would join in the consensus. They may offer some other pieces of information to make the decision a little bit more acceptable, but that's basically how it works. all three sides had equal weight. Now, when those three sides come together, the voices that are spoken in that Grand Council or in any council are basically the voices that have been carried from the people through not by the chiefs or the clan mothers specifically or solely, but through a clan system. So we had a system that was completely tied to community councils, both at the clan level or the family level, I should say, for lack of a better word, because I know clan sometimes, especially when they put a K on it, has a different sound, a different meaning to it. But so at the family level, at the community level, at the nation level, and at the confederacy level. But it all starts with the people. So ours was truly a system of governance through the people. And in fact, we didn't even call it governance. Honestly, we didn't. This was just the means by which we resolved conflicts or made decisions or moved forward in a way that might have been different than we were doing the day before necessarily. Now again, three sides of a longhouse are not the same thing as the three branches of the U.S. government. Let me explain that. The three branches of the government are the judicial system, the courts, the executive branch, which is essentially the president and the presidential administration, and the legislative branch, which is Congress. And of course, many of the states have a similar system that break down in their system of federalism from basically sometimes from county or municipalities to counties to states and then to the federal government. But that's the basic system of government: executive branch, legislative branch, and judicial branch. And that's what trickles down, again, down to localities. That's not what we had. That is not what we didn't have one side of the longhouse being the executive branch, one side being the judicial branch, and one side being the legislative branch. No, all three sides deliberated or were involved in everything from counseling over a matter of conflict, judicial, uh, passing something that was going to be, maybe a newly established way of doing something, legislative, or making decisions, even decisions involving things like going to war, executive decisions. So all three sides, meaning the clans, were involved all the while. Among the symbols that we use in one of the wampums we use, it shows our people all with our heads at the same level. Again, an absolute avoidance and aversion to hierarchy. We ignored that. Now, there are many people who will talk about Grand Chiefs. They'll talk about, Onondaga being the capital of the Confederacy. None of that stuff is true because we didn't have hierarchies. So, and when I talk about clan system, I want people to remember we're talking about men and women equally, and frankly, even children. There was no age limit. Okay, well, you can't speak. I mean, once you were old enough to have an opinion and express an opinion and have the respect of your family to speak up, then you could. That's the way the system worked. We use an analogy, the word gawazerde, which is the word for fire, and that fire can mean a number of things. It can mean literally a fire. But that fire is a symbol of our family and of our council, meaning coming together to council. It's like the symbol of assembly, of our right to assemble. I got to speak like in white man's terms, I guess. But so that's what the fire represents. Again, protection, family, warmth, obviously. I mean, it symbolizes a bunch of things within, and we even referred to it. We referred to the fires: our longhouse fire, our family fire, our clan fire, the men's fire, the women's fire. And when we refer to these things, we're always talking about the rights of the various groups, even medicine societies, that they too have a fire, that they have the right to assemble and deliberate over issues that they have some purview over, or deliberate over certain issues that they want to raise to the community, nation, or confederacy level. So that's basically our process. Now, we can argue about whether it's efficient or not, but the fact of the matter is that we existed in this manner and we operated in this manner for arguably thousands of years. I know people want to say, "Oh, well, when was the Confederacy formed? When was the Guyana-Iragoa established?" And people try to associate it with a solar eclipse, and the 1400s, the 1500s. All that stuff is bunk. It's all speculation. We don't attribute a date in time. We don't even mark our history in that same manner. All we know is that there came a time after a series of times that our nations had grown apart, that we came back together, and the Guyana-Iragoa represents, and that Hiawatha Belt represents the time that the final time that we had conflict and then came together. That's our final unification, the one that we still acknowledge today. So now let me talk about the Constitution. The U.S. Constitution was, again, written by white men for white men, rich white men. And it offered nothing to women, no say to women. It offered nothing if you weren't a land holding, even though it meant land stealing person. So if you didn't own land, and if you were a woman, and if you were black or native or anybody else other than essentially an Englishman, you had nothing. You had no say. The governing system was about electing representatives. Not everybody got the vote. There was no one man, one vote system in the United States under the U.S. Constitution. That Constitution didn't include any of that. No, it subjugated women. It subjugated people who were indentured servants. It subjugated black men, and again, it was anything but democratic. I mean, if you're only going to say a certain class of people get to weigh in on governing systems, that's not democracy, especially if they're subjugating everybody else. And how did they even distribute who did get a say? Well, they did set up a system that allowed the colonies, or what would be states, to have a certain apportionment of representation. Well, how did that work out? Well, since their legislative system has two different pieces, they had the Congress and the Senate, neither one of them were democratic. The Senate appointed two persons two men for each state, regardless of population. So a state that had very little population got just as much representation in the U.S. Senate, still to this day, as a state that, whether you had a large population or small population, it doesn't matter. So that disproportionately worked for states that had smaller populations because they had just as much say, arguably more say per population than the populated states, and that automatically favored the South. And why would that be? Well, because the South didn't have as much population. Even as the South developed economically, they did it through slavery. And one of the ways, not only did everything get skewed towards their benefit on the Senate side, but on the House side, the House of Representatives side, they were apportioned representation based on their slave holdings. Now, those enslaved were not considered citizens, and they were not counted as whole human beings. They are counted as 3/5 of a human being. That's in the Constitution. So their bodies were counted for the apportionment of representation to give the South, the slave states, a little bit more representation. Now, they already had the advantage on the Senate side. Now they had the advantage on the House side too. And of course, as we've seen historically, up to today, we understand the manipulation of things like gerrymandering to make sure that you can fix the congressional districts, so you can fix how many go to the right and how many go to the left. So, I mean, it, again, absolutely defies this notion of democracy and the value of equal, one man, one vote, and again, it was one man, one white man vote. It would be a long time before there would be, anything even close. I mean, even to this day, let's acknowledge that Trump's first victory as president, he lost the popular vote. So it's not a democratic system. It's not a majority rule in no way, shape, or form, because they have the electoral college and the way some of these electoral votes. Because what your vote is supposed to impact the electoral college, but not necessarily directly, and not evenly from state to state. Some are winner take all, some are not. I mean, it is a really, really screwed up system, and it defies any notion of equity that Native people had in our system. So, again, I hope even in this little brief explanation, I've debunked this notion that they had copied us. Now, here's what I will say: the framers of the Constitution, and even the early founders, or prominent people of the colonies, did see that the Haudenosaunee, the Six Nations, had formed a union that they were envious of. Ben Franklin wrote specifically. He said, "Well, how would it be that a group of ignorant savages could form a union that seems indissoluble when a dozen or more colonies can't seem to do that?" I mean, that's literally Franklin telling his constituents, his fellow framers, and this is before the Constitution. This is just forming a governing system among the colonies, not states, this is pre Revolutionary War. He basically was praising that a group of ignorant savages, the Haudenosaunee, and I think he was being condescending to make a point, more to make a point to his audience, not necessarily to throw us under a bus. I mean, I'm not saying he wasn't, but his point was, how could these people do this and form a union that seems perpetual, like it's existed for since time immemorial, and we're too busy fighting amongst ourselves? That's what he said. So they also knew, as they were approaching this notion of declaring independence from the United Kingdom, that they had to create something different than what existed in Europe in order to really make the argument, submit the facts to a candid world, that what existed under the British monarchy in particular was not something that could work in a land that was not the United Kingdom. And so they knew they had to create something new. Now, and I'm not suggesting that they didn't look at elements of the Haudenosaunee, of the Kanien'kehá:ka. I mean, this notion that Six Nations could stand on equal footing and then come together to form a centralized. Yeah, I think they might have copied that notion, but nothing else. No rights, no individual rights, no sovereignty is vested in as a birthright. No, they were declaring that their government was the sovereign, just like the monarchy was doing. In fact, they debated on how to create some of these positions, including what would ultimately call the president. Now, look, they didn't call him the king. They didn't call him the ruler. They didn't call him, even His Excellency. None of that stuff. Understand that the word president, it comes from the word to preside. In no means is it supposed to have resembled, at least in word, this notion of this ultimate authority over everything. But the system they created kind of did. The system they created, they may have only called it the president, he who presides. But even if the Constitution did it, what we're seeing today with this current administration is how abusive that power can become when there is no checks and balances. See, that's the other thing they tried to suggest. Well, they created something that was going to create a checks and balances. No, we had a true checks and balance because the three sides of our longhouse were even. But that's not what exists in the United States. I mean, you've got a president who can not only dictate what Congress will do, He can also create essentially laws, although he calls them executive orders, without the legislature whatsoever. He also gets to appoint Supreme Court justices that sit in those seats forever, for life. So there's so much that is not equitable, that is not a representation of equality in the U.S. Constitution, that it bears no resemblance to the Guyana de Goa. Now, again, they did create something that was somewhat distinct. It wasn't, completely distinct from what was already evolving in Europe through the Magna Carta and other things like that. But one thing it clearly did is that it ascended men to those positions in a way that was just not even questioned. And it was white men, it was rich white men. And frankly, the system that exists in the United States today is the same. In fact, it's even worse. I mean, what was created with the U.S. Constitution was so geared towards white, wealthy men being able to dictate everything that the disparity is greater now than it was then. I mean, that there's this exercise lady who claimed only 2% of the of Americans held slaves. I don't know if that's even true, but it's less than 2% that control the preponderance of wealth in the United States, and that small percentage buys elections, it buys privilege, it buys everything. The political system, the elections themselves, it destroys economies. It essentially has been responsible for war, famine, poverty, and of course the incredibly, almost grotesque disparity between the haves and the have-nots. This isn't a breakdown of the U.S. Constitution. It's the way it was designed from the start. This is where it was going. So I reject the notion that anybody would suggest that the U.S. Constitution is this model of excellence, American greatness, American exceptionalism that was in any way, shape, or form borrowed from us. It wasn't. It was not. So while I appreciate the intent, perhaps, of making that argument, and I think the real thing that should be argued here is that we weren't primitive, that we had a sophisticated system that was complicated, yes, on one hand, but simple on the other. Was it efficient? No, not necessarily, but it was thorough. And we had the right ideology to make that work for thousands of years. So this notion that we were ignorant savages, even as Ben Franklin cited it, simply wasn't true. We had solved so many problems of our own, and some that were created by others. We formed unions with other nations. We had treaty councils. We did all of that stuff, including the treaties that we had entered in with the United States, that the United States defaulted on. So, the biggest problem that we had was that once we became inundated with European ideologies, there became a separation between those people that we put into the positions as servants of our people, literally servants of our people, those people that you would know as chiefs or even clan mothers, that once the outside came to understand our system, they said, well, we don't want to get involved with clans. We don't want to get involved with your internal system. We just give us the guys who have the authority. And so they elevated men in our communities to the point where our egos, the egos of our men, got so stroked that it undermined, and we no longer had a clan system. In fact, most people would call what we had a chief system. Some people even call it a hereditary chief system because of a misunderstanding on how the clan mothers would nominate somebody to represent the clan from on the male side. As well, she would always nominate her sons. Well, that's not exactly the translation. So there's so much that gets missed and lost in translation, some of it intentionally. So from East Coast to West Coast, what you had was the United States constantly dismissing our people, just like they dismissed their own, to only deal with people that they viewed had the, not necessarily the intellect, but the authority to represent their people and sign stuff away. That's what we were, I mean, that's what we faced. That's what we were faced with. So there was no, again, there was no modeling the U.S. Constitution after our ways. And in fact, I mean, in our film, The Long Hope, again, we're doing a screening and on the 21st at University of Buffalo. There's a passage in there by my friend Gunnar Zaraga. Some people know his name is Loran, where he said, if the system that we had been followed, we'd be living a very good life today. Because it's clear that it wasn't. I mean, and I know there are people. Look, there are people who are from my communities that like to make this claim that the Constitution was modeled after us. I've seen people across social media, podcasts, vlogs, blogs, all kinds. People do it constantly. I'm not one of them. So I wanted to state that and make that very, very clear. All right, so let me move on. The other one that has been trending lately, and I've seen 3 specific reels or video postings or whatever else of conflict or of content that address the issue of non-native people claiming that we were conquered. Now, when people understand the idea of conquest, it's usually a violent thing, a victory, a military victory over a people, a surrender. Now, I've got to say that not only is that just not correct. For one thing, I want to say again, part of what I talk about in the film, which is this the 3 legal doctrines that came out of the slave era: the doctrine of Christian discovery, the trust doctrine, and the plenary powers doctrine. The first one, the doctrine of Christian discovery, the U.S. Supreme Court Chief Justice John Marshall basically equated this notion that once we were discovered, we were conquered. He equated conquest with discovery. I mean, he said basically our sovereignty was necessarily diminished just upon discovery by white people laying their eyes, white Christians laying their eyes upon us. Not only were we now discovered, but that our lands and our people were conquered. And nobody refutes that to this day. That is, to this day, the doctrine of Christian discovery is used in U.S. law. And it's not a law, it's just a legal principle advanced by the Supreme Court in 1823. As bizarre as that is. So, this notion that regardless of the fact that there were already many treaties that were entered into before Chief Justice John Marshall came up with this notion, and on those treaties there was a full acknowledgement about us owning and occupying and owning the land that we're on, and there was never anything in the U.S. Constitution that ever suggested that we were a conquered people, a subjugated people. The U.S. Constitution wasn't made for us. We were excluded from it. Even in the apportionment clause, where they were counting black, the enslaved folks as 3/5 of a man, we weren't counted at all because we weren't a part of it. So, when Chief Justice John Marshall suggests that mere discovery was the same as conquest, that gains traction amongst, again, the white supremacists of the United States. But it's not true. In fact, out of the 700 or 800 distinct peoples that existed across this continent, more than that if you count all of the distinct peoples going up into what is now known as Canada, of all those people, the United States only had conflicts with less than 50 of them, of us. And many of the conflicts weren't directly with us. It was really that we got sucked into their either into the Revolutionary War or their Civil War. But there was never a declaration of war by the United States against the Haudenosaunee. Now, I'm not saying we weren't murdered and we weren't the victims of U.S. terrorism. We were. I mean, the Sullivan campaign that was launched by George Washington said, let them, meaning the Senecas and the Cayugas in particular, but Mohawks as well, let them know the terror of their chastisement. So we were being having a war waged against us because of their conflict with Great Britain, not because we were at war with them specifically. And so many innocent Native lives were lost that were not even a part of the conflict. Only certain segments of our warrior societies, if you would, took a side in that. Not everybody. But of all the armed conflicts that the United States had with Native people, for one thing, they didn't win them all. I mean, there are several, I won't say many, but there are several of those conflicts where the United States just said, no, we can't win this. We're just going to walk away here. We're not going to go after the Seminoles anymore. We're not going to go after the Comanche anymore. We're not going to go after some of the Lakota. Now we're going to announce a cessation of hostilities against some of these people because it ain't going well. So not only was there not a unanimous victory over all Native peoples, there wasn't even conflict with all Native peoples. So if you're going to say that the United States had a military conflict with dozens of Native peoples, and then claim that represented conquest to hundreds of Native peoples, I mean, that's just an absurd proposition. But if in the back pocket you've got this notion, yeah, but we already established that just merely discovering you is the same as conquering you. So when I hear white folks suggest that we are a conquered people, that we're just a bunch of ignorant savages stuck in the Stone Age, and they make all of these just derogatory racist assumptions about who we were, of course it's refutable. It's wrong, and it absolutely warrants being rejected. But the problem that I have is, who are we now? Because my argument, and the reason I raise the issue about our identity, and I mean it in terms of how we define ourselves, is because it ends up getting back to this notion of whether we are a conquered or subjugated people. So in all the videos that I saw refuting this notion of conquest, they never continue the conversation all the way through to say, but are we part of the United States now? Are we U.S. citizens? And if so, why? How did we get here? Well, we know that in 1924, having already done some level of indoctrination and granting citizenship to some Native peoples, in 1924 they passed the Indian Citizenship Act, where they declared that all Native people born within the lands that the United States controlled were hereby declared to be U.S. citizens. Well, we didn't agree to that. We didn't ask for that. You did it to check a box to solve a problem. You thought that would just solve your Indian problem. Because once you fully incorporated us, even though it would be so without any rights, kind of like when you freed the enslaved. So in 1924, you decided that we were all U.S. citizens. But we didn't make that decision. But in that 100 years that have passed since then, the vast, and I'll admit it, overwhelming majority of Native people believe that they are U.S. citizens. On the Canadian side, they believe they are Canadian citizens. They don't stand on our own autonomy, on our own distinction, on our own free and independent existence. So it begs the question, are we a conquered people? Did we allow that law in 1924 to incorporate us into their system, to subjugate us? And so my question is, look, I know before the ending of slavery that the overwhelming majority of black people, especially in the South, were enslaved. So ending slavery and declaring that they were now citizens out of the 14th Amendment, I understand you went from being enslaved to being U.S. citizens. That's not the same thing as freedom, folks. Being a U.S. citizen is not the same as being free. So my question is, what were we before 1924? Were we free before 1924? Yes, we were. Were we independent? Yes, we were. So we were a free and independent people, even if we were still experiencing a lot of oppression. Legally, we were considered a free and independent people. In 1924, did that end? Did we cease to be a free and independent people? So we went from being a free people to being what? U.S. citizens? I mean, Native people couldn't vote still. That didn't happen. There were, and then we exist in this, I call it the American purgatory, where the United States wants to pretend to acknowledge certain levels of our distinction, but not all of it. And I'm saying, no, you don't get to choose what level of distinction we maintain. We get to choose that. So if you're going to have that conversation about not being a conquered people, if you're going to sit there and say that as a Native person who's embraced and acknowledged and accepted U.S. citizenship, you should just shut the hell up. I'm sorry. Because you're in no position to talk about not being a conquered people if you're sitting there saying it as a subjugated American, as a U.S. citizen. And I get it. This does tie back to this notion that somehow the U.S. Constitution was based on our system. Because now we get to say, well, see, we're kind of accepting something that they got from us anyway. No, they're not. They didn't get it from us. You know, again, last week I talked about the Tuawa Wampum, the fact that we're instructed as a part of our existence to maintain the path that we were set on by creation. And not be lured into the other path. Not be lured from our canoe into their ship, where they got all their little shiny objects, most of which they stole from us in the first place. So, accepting U.S. citizenship, whether you do it only at a token level to enjoy what you think are certain privileges that come with that, but then want to argue that you're autonomous and you're distinct and that you're sovereign, you can't argue those two things. You can't say that you are a sovereign people and that you're a U.S. citizen at the same time. I know they take this notion and they put the word tribal in front of it, the word sovereignty. I remember George Bush struggling with this notion of native sovereignty. And he just, he was clueless. He had no idea. I don't know if anybody ever, I encourage people to find that video and post it. What does tribal sovereignty mean? Oh, it means that they are sovereign. Well, what does that mean? And he couldn't even wrap his head around it. Why? Because they are just as confused about it as our people are. So, my suggestion is that if we're going to talk about not being a conquered people, we have to also talk about not being U.S. citizens. Otherwise, we're saying we weren't conquered militarily, but we were conquered legislatively because they passed a law? So we were conquered by their Congress? Not by their military? We surrendered to a law? To their force of law? That's what we surrendered to? Most of us didn't. We exist in this, again, I call it American purgatory, in this place that is nondescript, that doesn't make any sense. It makes no historical sense, makes no legal sense, makes no constitutional sense. And we're not the only ones. I mean, you've got places like Hawaii, you got places like Puerto Rico, you got places like Guam, you got, Samoa, you got all these places that the United States and other countries. Look, the absurd proposition that Alaska was sold to the United States by Russia when they didn't even live there. They had outposts set up on what was considered Alaskan territory. Outposts, camps. Meanwhile, there were permanent native people living throughout the region who had the land claimed from out from underneath them by Russia. Then Russia sells it to the United States, and then the United States goes about trying to wipe out much of the resources right out from underneath the native people who lived there for thousands and thousands of years. Folks, that's not democracy. And you know what else? That's also not legal within your Constitution. Because as Maggie Blackhawk points out, there was, small c, the constitution of imperialism and colonialism that defied any of the rights defined within the large C Constitution of the United States. And nobody's ever reconciled colonialism with the Constitution. Just like nobody's ever been able to reconcile who and what we are. I know you passed your law in 1924, but regardless of that, it is a false narrative to suggest that you could simply declare and pass a law that would force us to be surrendered and subjugated to your country. I'm not conquered. I have not been conquered. I am not a U.S. citizen. I am not a lawful permanent resident of the United States. I'm Ongwe. That's who I am. I live on the territory of the Onondaga. That's where I live. My wife, I'm Gonyagahaga, Ongwe, but I'm Gonyagahaga. That's where my people are from, land of Flint. My wife is Onyotaaga. You know it as Oneida, and as are my children. I am not a part. Now, anybody, including my children and my grandchildren, they can claim whatever they want to claim. It's a choice. The thing I'll say about being an American citizen, we are given that choice, but that choice was not made for us. We have to make that choice. I hope I cleared some of that stuff up. And by all means, I'm willing to debate this and have this conversation with anybody. So if you're listening and you know somebody who has a different view, let's have it. Let's have it. Maybe we'll do a show on it. I don't know. I want to thank you for listening. I want to thank you for supporting the program on WBAI in New York City and on WPFW in Washington, D.C. I am John Kane, and this is Resistance Radio. Yahweh.